Maya sat alone at her desk in the quiet library, the hum of the fluorescent lights above her the only sound breaking the silence. She glanced up every now and then, watching the few patrons who passed by, some lost in books, others in their own lives, and none who ever seemed to notice her. She had grown used to it, this feeling of being invisible, as though she were just another piece of furniture in the corner of the room, blending into the stacks of books around her. She loved the library, truly its calm, the smell of paper, the way time seemed to slow down among the shelves, but over the years, it had become both a refuge and a prison. Maya had always been a quiet person, introverted to her core, but the isolation she felt in the library had begun to weigh heavily on her. She had no close friends, no one to share a coffee with after work or laugh with on weekends. She was alone, surrounded by people, but disconnected from them in a way that left her heart aching. Every day, she came to work in the same clothes, sat in the same chair, and did the same things: shelving books, helping the occasional patron, checking out a few items, but nothing ever changed. Her interactions were brief, polite, and empty. She wondered if anyone ever noticed how her eyes seemed dull, how her smile never quite reached her face. The truth was, Maya felt lost in the world outside the library, unsure of how to connect, unsure if she even belonged. At night, when she returned to her small apartment, the loneliness would press in on her again, heavier than before. The silence felt like a living thing, creeping through her walls, suffocating her. She would eat dinner alone, watch a bit of TV, and then retreat to bed, where she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if things would ever change. She longed for meaningful connections, for someone to truly see her, to hear her, but no one seemed to notice the young librarian who blended into the background. Her life had become a routine, a series of quiet days and lonely nights, each one blending into the next until they all felt like one long stretch of emptiness. She used to dream of finding her place in the world, of meeting people who could understand her, but now those dreams felt like distant memories, fading like the books that filled the shelves she spent her days tending. She wondered if she would ever be more than the librarian, more than the girl behind the desk, the one who could recommend books but not make meaningful connections. The library was her life, her world, but it was also the barrier keeping her from the world outside. It kept her safe in its quiet corners, but it also isolated her, locking her in a bubble where nothing ever seemed to change. Maya had tried to reach out in the past, to talk to her co-workers, to say something more than the usual pleasantries. But each attempt felt clumsy, awkward, and after a while, she stopped trying. She had learned to accept the loneliness, to live with it as a constant companion. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she imagined a different life, one where she was known, where she mattered. She saw couples laughing together in coffee shops, friends meeting for dinner, and she longed to be a part of that, to feel seen, to feel real. Yet, every time she made an effort, it always seemed to fall short. The disconnect felt like an unspoken barrier she couldn't break through, and no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't escape the cycle of solitude. One rainy afternoon, as she sat at her desk, a child wandered up to her. He couldn't have been older than 6, clutching a picture book in his tiny hands. He looked up at Maya, his big eyes curious, and asked, "Can you help me find the book about the bear?" His voice was soft, tentative, but his gaze was direct, unafraid. Maya blinked, caught off guard by the simple request. For a moment, she didn't know what to say, but then she smiled, the genuine kind, the kind that reached her eyes, and led him to the section where the children's books were kept. As they walked through the aisles, the child chatted happily about the bear in the story, telling Maya things she didn't expect, things she hadn't heard in a long time, a story from someone else's life, a child's innocent view of the world. Maya showed him the book, knelt down to his level, and listened as he excitedly told her how much he loved the bear's adventures. When the child's mother arrived to collect him, he turned to Maya with a beaming smile and said, "Thank you for helping me find the bear." In that simple, innocent moment, Maya felt something stir within her, something like hope. For a brief second, she wasn't just the librarian. She was a part of someone else's world, important, even if just for a moment. The encounter didn't change everything. She still returned to her quiet apartment that night, and the loneliness still lingered. But that brief interaction, that fleeting connection, left her with something she hadn't felt in a long time, the reminder that sometimes, it's the small moments that make us feel seen. Maya might have spent most of her days alone, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope in the world beyond the library walls, hope that one day, someone would walk through those doors and make her feel a little less invisible. It began with a simple letter. Maya, sorting through her mail one chilly morning, noticed an envelope with no return address, just her name written in delicate, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, the note was short but sweet. "You are stronger than you know, Maya. Keep going." She smiled at the kindness, brushing it off as a random act of goodwill, but as the days passed, the letters kept coming. Each note, though unsigned, was filled with a warm encouragement that seemed tailored to her, offering support during moments when doubt crept in, when she felt overwhelmed by the demands of life. The messages, always positive and uplifting, gave her an unexpected sense of comfort, like a quiet, unseen presence watching over her. But as the weeks went by, the tone of the letters changed slightly. At first, so subtle that Maya almost didn't notice. The simple affirmations shifted toward more personal sentiments, like "Your smile brightens the darkest days," or "The world is better with you in it." These words, though flattering, began to stir something deeper in her, a flutter of curiosity mixed with confusion. Who could be behind these? There was no signature, no clue as to the identity of her mysterious admirer, and yet each letter seemed to know just the right thing to say. Maya felt a mixture of wonder and unease. She had always been a private person, and while she appreciated the kindness, the growing intimacy of the messages left her wondering how someone could know her so well without ever meeting her. Who could it be, and why were they doing this? Were they watching her from a distance? The letters, though sweet, soon began to feel almost intrusive, like someone peering into her life without her consent. Despite the disquiet that tugged at her, a part of her couldn't help but look forward to them. There was something undeniably comforting about receiving a message so deeply personal, so full of warmth, even if it came from an unknown source. It was as though the words spoke to a loneliness inside her she hadn't fully acknowledged, the quiet ache of being unseen despite the crowds around her. But then, one day, the letter arrived with words that left her breathless. "I see you, Maya. All of you. Your heart, your fears, your dreams. And I promise, I will always be here for you, no matter where life takes us." This was no longer just encouragement, it was a confession, an admission of affection. Maya's heart raced, her mind spinning as she reread the message over and over. The letters, once simply uplifting, had now evolved into something else, something undeniably romantic. She couldn't help but wonder if there was someone she knew, someone close to her, who had been secretly observing her, someone who harbored feelings for her that were now being poured into these carefully written letters. But the mystery deepened. The handwriting was always consistent, elegant, yet she couldn't place it. And, perhaps more troubling, There were never any clues, no slip UPS, no accidental reveals. The anonymity of the letters was both intoxicating and maddening. Maya found herself torn between the desire to know who was behind them and the fear of what the discovery might mean. Was it someone she had overlooked? Someone she would never have expected? The more the letters spoke of affection, the more Maya became consumed by the question of who could possibly understand her this well, of who had watched her so carefully. With each new note, the romantic gestures, the thoughtful expressions, the promises of care, Maya's emotions became a tangle of anticipation, confusion, and, above all, hope. Hope that perhaps, just maybe, someone out there saw her, truly saw her, in a way she hadn't allowed anyone to. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she craved, being seen in her entirety, beyond her carefully guarded exterior. Yet the mystery loomed. Every letter brought with it the same overwhelming curiosity: who was this person? And why the secrecy? The puzzle lingered in her mind, occupying her thoughts day and night, distracting her from her routine and causing her heart to race with every fresh note that arrived. Could it be a long-lost friend? A colleague? Or perhaps a stranger who had been watching from afar? No matter how much Maya wondered, the answers eluded her, leaving her both thrilled and unsettled by the unknown. As the letters continued, Maya found herself longing for the day when the mystery would be revealed, when the sender would finally step forward and reveal themselves. But in the meantime, each letter continued to fill her with a mix of emotions: joy, confusion, longing, and an ever-deepening sense of connection to someone she hadn't yet met. The mystery was not just about the sender, but about herself, about the way these anonymous words made her feel seen, appreciated, and loved in a way that was both mysterious and undeniably real. And so, Maya waited, caught in the delicate tension between the anticipation of discovery and the beauty of the unknown, each letter a reminder that sometimes, love begins in the quietest of ways, and that even in anonymity, there can be a truth so powerful it touches the heart. Each letter arrived on an ordinary day, tucked into the folds of Maya's routine like a quiet whisper from an unknown source. At first, she thought it was a fluke, a mistaken delivery, an accidental gesture. But then another came, and then another, each one carefully written, each one infused with a tenderness that made her heart flutter and her thoughts spin. The words were simple, yet profound, capturing moments of her life with an accuracy that made Maya wonder if the writer had been watching her from afar. No name was ever signed, and no return address ever appeared. The letters didn't demand anything from her: no replies, no actions, only words that seemed to speak directly to her heart, offering understanding, encouragement, and a sense of connection that she hadn't realized she'd been craving. As Maya read each letter, she began to imagine the person behind them, crafting a mental image of this mysterious admirer, a person who seemed to know her better than anyone else, who understood the things she never spoke aloud, the fears she never admitted, and the dreams she kept hidden deep within herself. The writer was gentle, perceptive, and, most strangely, comforting. In a world where Maya often felt invisible, these letters offered her something she had been missing: someone who truly saw her. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the unspoken understanding that resonated in each sentence, an acknowledgement that Maya, with all her flaws and insecurities, was worth noticing. Slowly, as the letters kept arriving, a shift began to take place within Maya. The loneliness she'd often felt started to soften, replaced by a growing sense of hope. She no longer felt as isolated in her thoughts: someone, somewhere, was paying attention. Someone cared, even if they were still a stranger. There was a warmth in the letters, a connection that reached her even in the quietest, most solitary moments of her life. The more she read, the more she began to believe that maybe there was more to the world than the emptiness she had sometimes felt. She imagined the writer perhaps someone kind, sensitive, someone who had been in the same places, experienced the same heartache, and understood the quiet ache of loneliness. She wondered if he, too, had moments when he longed for something more, when he felt as though he was drifting through life without a clear anchor. The idea of this person, this secret admirer, was a balm to her soul. Maya could almost picture him, someone reserved yet gentle, someone who could see past the surface and understand the unspoken intricacies of her world. She imagined late evenings spent walking through the city, sharing quiet conversations that stretched into the night, exchanging looks that said everything words couldn't. She imagined someone who would listen when she needed to speak and hold her when the world felt too much. Though the letters never asked for anything in return, Maya began to feel a desire to know the person behind them, to thank them for offering her a glimpse of warmth and kindness when she had been drowning in silence. But she also knew there was something fragile about these letters, something sacred in the anonymity they offered. The mystery of the writer became just as important to her as the words themselves, and she found herself drawn to the idea of this person existing somewhere, without needing to know their identity. The thought of them, with their quiet understanding, became a source of comfort, a tether to hope in her otherwise ordinary world. In her imagination, Maya constructed a life for the secret admirer. She imagined them walking the same streets, sitting at the same cafes, breathing the same air. They were part of the world she navigated, yet completely out of reach, a figment of her mind's creation that brought her a strange solace. The letters, each one filled with empathy, warmth, and a touch of longing, breathed life into Maya's heart in ways she hadn't expected. The solitude that had once felt like an insurmountable weight began to feel lighter, as though the mere knowledge that someone, somewhere, was thinking of her, caring for her, was enough to lift the veil of loneliness. Every letter, though unsigned, seemed to contain more than just words. It held hope, promise, and the quiet belief that perhaps she, too, was deserving of love. And for the first time in a long while, Maya believed it. The secret admirer had become more than a stranger in her life. They had become the reflection of everything she had longed for: understanding, connection, and the possibility that someone out there could truly see her, in all her vulnerability and strength. The letters, though unsigned, carried a message that resonated far deeper than any of the words on the page. They were a declaration of worth, a reminder that love, in its purest form, doesn't always demand anything in return. It simply exists, quietly and persistently, as a thread woven through the fabric of our lives. In the anonymity of the letters, Maya found the courage to embrace herself, to believe that perhaps, even without knowing the writer's identity, she was seen, she was cared for, and she was not as alone as she once thought. The secret admirer had unknowingly given her the most precious gift of all, the belief that hope, love, and understanding still existed in the world, and that maybe, just maybe, they were closer than she had ever imagined. Maya had always lived a life of quiet simplicity, her days spent in the routine of cleaning offices, her nights filled with the soft hum of a world that seemed to pass her by without much notice. She never expected anything more, never imagined that someone beyond her small circle would take an interest in her life. But everything changed the day she discovered the truth behind the mysterious letters that had begun arriving at her modest apartment. For weeks, Maya had received handwritten notes, simple, beautiful words of encouragement, kindness, and sometimes, a gentle nudge to remind her of her own worth. The letters, unsigned, were like a quiet balm to her soul, arriving just when she needed them most. At first, she had dismissed them as the musings of an anonymous stranger, someone who had no real connection to her life. But as the letters grew more personal, more attuned to her struggles and joys, Maya began to wonder if perhaps there was someone out there who truly saw her, someone who understood the small, hidden pieces of her life that even her closest friends didn't know. She never could have imagined, though, that the source of the letters would be someone like Daniel. Daniel. The name alone was enough to send a shiver down her spine. He was everything she was not: wealthy, influential, a businessman whose name was plastered across newspapers and magazines. He was the kind of man who walked through life with an air of confidence, surrounded by luxury and opportunities that Maya could only dream of. The first time she saw him in person, she could hardly believe it. He had been attending a charity event at one of the buildings she cleaned, and she had caught a brief glimpse of him across the crowded room, dapper, poised, with a magnetic presence that seemed to command the attention of everyone around him. She had barely exchanged a word with him, as her job was to stay in the background, cleaning up after the event, but that brief moment had left an indelible impression on her. So when the discovery was made, when she realized that the same man who had barely noticed her at the event was the one who had been sending the letters all this time, Maya was stunned. Her mind could hardly wrap itself around the idea. How could someone like him, someone with so much wealth, status, and power, take the time to write to someone like her? Someone who barely existed in the world he inhabited, someone whose life was full of mundane struggles, a life that seemed to matter so little to anyone else. Maya felt a rush of disbelief, followed by a strange, lingering feeling of wonder. She didn't understand why Daniel had chosen to write to her, why he had seen something in her worth noticing. Her heart raced as she pieced together the clues from the letters: the way he had spoken of her kindness, of the way she carried herself through life with such quiet strength, of the small, yet significant things that made her who she was. Each letter had felt like a mirror, reflecting the parts of herself she hadn't been able to see before. She realized, with a mix of awe and fear, that he had noticed her long before she had ever noticed him. The thought left her speechless, her emotions a swirl of gratitude, confusion, and self-doubt. Why would Daniel, a man who could have any woman he wanted, take the time to reach out to someone like her? She wondered if he had mistaken her for someone else, or if it was some form of charity on his part, a way to feel good about himself without ever truly knowing her. But as the days passed, her doubts began to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of curiosity. What did it mean for someone like Daniel to see her, to care enough to send those letters? And more importantly, what did it mean for her? The realization that someone so out of reach, someone so far removed from her world, had been paying such close attention to her felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It made her question the very limits of her life, the walls she had built around herself to keep the world at arm's length. In one sense, the discovery felt like a kind of awakening, a reminder that life could hold surprises beyond her expectations, that perhaps she was worth more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. But in another sense, it felt like a leap into the unknown, a step into a world she wasn't sure she belonged to. As she pondered this new reality, Maya found herself faced with a choice: whether to step into the mystery of the letters and the man behind them, or to retreat back into the life she knew, where she was safe in her anonymity, where no one like Daniel would ever come knocking at her door. It was a choice she never thought she would have to make, a moment that would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet fathom. But as she stared at the last letter Daniel had sent, her heart thumped with a new kind of anticipation, because, for the first time in a long time, Maya felt seen. Truly, deeply seen. And that was a feeling she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of. For years, Daniel had silently observed Maya from the shadows, his feelings growing deeper with each passing day, yet never once finding the courage to speak them aloud. To the world, he appeared distant, absorbed in his work, and nearly unreachable, a quiet figure whose presence was often overlooked, but within him was a heart quietly aching for a woman he admired in ways he couldn't fully express. Maya, with her warmth, her effortless kindness, and her unassuming beauty, was everything he had ever wanted but never believed he could have. She moved through the world with a grace that seemed to light up even the darkest corners, and Daniel, from his position of quiet longing, watched her from afar, a silent witness to her life. His feelings, tender and powerful, remained unspoken, locked away in the depths of his soul, hidden behind a facade of casual indifference that he wore like armor. He was too afraid to confront her, too paralyzed by his own insecurities to risk rejection, so instead, he expressed his love in a way that was both intimate and distant through letters. These letters, written in the stillness of the night when his heart would overflow with emotion, were his only outlet. They weren't meant to be sent, they were simply a catharsis, a way for Daniel to pour his soul onto paper, articulating feelings he couldn't voice. In each letter, he told her everything: how her smile brightened his day, how her laughter filled the spaces in his chest that had once been empty, how the very thought of her kept him awake at night, yearning for something he knew he could never have. The letters were a quiet confession, a secret he could not share but also couldn't keep hidden. He would write them, fold them neatly, and tuck them away in a drawer, each one an unspoken testament to his love. The irony, however, was that Daniel didn't need to look for reasons to love her, they were everywhere. It was in the way Maya made everyone around her feel like they mattered, the way she listened with a kindness that made people feel heard and seen, the way she spoke about her dreams with such passion that it was impossible not to believe in them. To Daniel, she wasn't just someone to admire from afar, she was a symbol of everything he had ever wanted but never dared to reach for. And yet, he kept his distance, not out of indifference, but out of fear. He feared the vulnerability that came with confession, the rawness that would expose him for who he truly was, a man too afraid to step forward. He feared that Maya, in her infinite kindness, might pity him, or worse, reject him entirely, shattering the fragile fantasy he had carefully built. The letters, then, were his only way to feel close to her, to feel like he could express something so real, so powerful, without the risk of exposing himself. He never expected Maya to read them, he never even intended for her to know they existed. They were his secret, his way of living in a world where his love for her could remain unspoken but not unnoticed. The painful part, however, was knowing that despite all his words, despite all his longing, the one thing he could never do was share these letters with her. Each letter was a small act of hope, a tiny spark of possibility, but it was also a reminder that his love could never reach her in the way he wanted it to. He lived in a quiet limbo, loving her without ever daring to ask for anything in return. And yet, in some deep, unspoken part of him, Daniel believed that she might sense his feelings, that maybe, just maybe, Maya could see through the distance he put between them, and somehow know the truth. There were moments when their paths crossed, brief encounters in the hall, a fleeting glance shared over the top of a coffee cup, but in those moments, Daniel's heart would race, and he would freeze, the words caught in his throat, the letters of 1,000 unspoken emotions locked away behind a smile he didn't feel. Maya, for her part, had no idea of Daniel's inner turmoil. To her, he was just another person in her orbit, someone who, like so many others, moved through life with a quiet dignity. She didn't know that Daniel's heart beat faster every time she entered the room, or that her name appeared in every letter he'd ever written, a constant refrain of love that he would never dare to speak aloud. But as the years went by, Daniel began to wonder if, in some way, his secret love for Maya had begun to change him. Each letter, each quiet confession, had softened him, made him more open to the world around him. And though he still couldn't find the courage to speak his feelings, he realized that maybe, just maybe, the act of loving her in silence had taught him something valuable, that love doesn't always need to be spoken to be real. His feelings for Maya had become a quiet force in his life, shaping him in ways he never expected, teaching him the power of love without expectation, without demand. It was a love that existed entirely in his heart, untouchable by time, untouched by the world. And though he would never share it with her, it was a love that he carried with him every day, a quiet, unspoken truth that filled the spaces where words could never go. Maya had always considered herself an ordinary woman, quiet, reserved, and content with her small, unassuming life. The days unfolded in a steady rhythm of work, errands, and solitary evenings that never seemed quite lonely, just peaceful in their predictability. That was until the first letter arrived, carefully folded, the ink on the paper so neatly scripted it almost seemed to echo a kind of reverence. At first, she had dismissed it as a mistake or perhaps the misguided gesture of someone who had confused her with someone else. But then came the second letter, and the third, each one filled with words that seemed to see into the very core of her, the parts of herself she had long kept hidden from the world, the hopes, the dreams, the quiet fears that only existed in the stillness of her thoughts. Each letter felt like a gentle invitation, a pull towards something she couldn't quite define, yet something she desperately wanted to understand. They arrived in secret, tucked between the pages of her favorite books, slipped into the pockets of her coat, or placed carefully on the small table by her door when she least expected it. With each one, her curiosity grew, but so did her uncertainty. The words were beautiful, thoughtful, and undeniably personal, and the more she read, the more the voice on the other side of the letters seemed familiar, too familiar. The realization struck her one evening as she sat alone, the latest letter resting in her lap, a quiet but insistent whisper creeping into her mind: it was Daniel. Of all the people she could have imagined behind the words, of all the possibilities, it had to be him, the same Daniel whose name had been the subject of whispered conversations and whose presence at the office often commanded the kind of attention she'd never known how to handle. He was everything she wasn't: wealthy, powerful, effortlessly charismatic. He moved through the world as though it bent around him, his life a constant stream of invitations and events, a whirlwind of people and prestige. And yet, here he was, sending her these letters, words that seemed too tender, too personal, to belong to someone like him. Someone who lived in a world she could barely comprehend. The thought of it unsettled her, the idea that someone so unreachable, so distant in every way that mattered, might be interested in her, someone so small and inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. How could he see her? How could he, with all the choices in the world, choose her, a woman who didn't even know how to stand out in a crowd, who preferred the quiet of her apartment to the glittering lights of the social events he was accustomed to? The more she thought about it, the deeper her internal conflict grew. On one hand, there was a part of her that felt a kind of exhilaration, a spark of something new, something she had never allowed herself to consider. The idea that someone like Daniel could see her, could be drawn to her in a way that was real and genuine, was intoxicating. It made her feel special, desired in a way that had always seemed reserved for others. But that exhilaration was always tainted by a sharp edge of doubt, the nagging voice in her mind telling her that she wasn't enough, that someone so powerful and influential could never truly understand her. She was just Maya, ordinary, quiet, invisible to most, and the gulf between her and him felt like an insurmountable chasm. What would he see if he truly got to know her? Could a man like him really be interested in a woman like her, or was this all some kind of game to him, a passing fancy that would disappear as quickly as it had arrived? Her heart ached with the complexity of the emotions swirling within her. Part of her wanted to reach out, to meet him in the same vulnerable space the letters created, to let him into the small, quiet world she had carefully constructed. But another part of her recoiled in fear, afraid of the disparity between their worlds, afraid that in meeting him, she would only confirm the insecurities that had always held her back, afraid that what she saw as a gift of connection was merely a cruel reminder of her place in a world that didn't make room for people like her. Maya tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the present, to enjoy the words he had so carefully crafted. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea of Daniel's true intentions loomed over her like a shadow, and the letters began to feel less like a romantic gesture and more like a test, one that she wasn't sure she could pass. The struggle between the longing for connection and the fear of rejection tore at her, and in the silence of her apartment, with the latest letter clutched in her trembling hands, Maya realized that the man behind these words was more than just an enigma. He was a mirror, reflecting her deepest desires and her greatest doubts. The revelation had made everything feel both closer and more distant, and the question now was no longer just about Daniel, but about herself. Could she bridge the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be, or would she always remain a stranger to herself? For months, Daniel had watched from the shadows, his presence hidden behind the veil of anonymity. He had written the words that had touched Maya's soul, leaving traces of himself in every line, every sentence, but never once revealing the man behind the pen. It was a secret history between them, a history built on words that resonated deeply within her, but which she never knew had come from him. Maya, unaware of the connection, had read those words with a sense of longing, as if someone else understood the parts of her heart she hadn't yet found the courage to confront. And now, after all this time, Daniel found himself standing at the threshold of something far more real than the words he had written. The evening was quiet, the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the cobbled streets, as Maya sat in her usual spot at the cafe, her book open but her mind far away, lost in the thoughts that always seemed to swirl around her. Daniel's heart raced as he stood on the edge of the room, feeling the weight of a decision that had been brewing for so long. He could no longer remain a ghost, hidden behind the anonymity of his words. It was time to step into the light. With every step he took toward her, the familiar tension tightened in his chest, an unspoken history between them that neither had ever acknowledged. He had no idea how she would react, how she would receive the truth that the man who had written those intimate, heartfelt words was now standing before her, a stranger with a history she could never fully understand. When he finally reached her table, Daniel stood for a moment, unsure, his breath caught in his throat. Maya looked up, her eyes widening in surprise as she recognized him, though not the writer, not the man whose words had comforted her through countless sleepless nights, but just another man in a cafe. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still, the distance between them measured not in space but in the weight of unspoken words. Maya, Daniel said, his voice trembling slightly, unsure of how to begin. He stopped, the weight of his admission pressing down on him. He had always thought the words he'd written to her were enough, but now, face to face with the woman who had unknowingly shaped so much of his life, he realized how inadequate those words had been. Maya, for her part, felt a flutter in her chest, an almost electric charge that stirred the air between them. Something about his presence, something familiar and yet unfamiliar, pulled at her. She had often wondered about the writer behind the words, the mysterious figure whose reflections had touched her so deeply. But seeing him here, in the flesh, she was struck by the vulnerability in his eyes, the uncertainty that lay just beneath the surface of his confident demeanor. "You're him?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to give too much away. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. I've been hiding for a long time, he admitted, his words raw, honest. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if you'd ever want to meet the man behind them. There was a quiet pause between them, a shared silence filled with the weight of their secret history, both wondering what this encounter might mean. Would Maya resent him for hiding behind his words, for making her fall in love with the thoughts of a man she never knew? Or would she see him as he truly was, a man who had longed to reach out, but had been too afraid? Maya took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her coffee cup, her mind racing with 1,000 emotions. The realization that the man whose words had become a part of her life, the one who had unknowingly filled the voids she hadn't known how to name, was standing right before her felt overwhelming. Her heart, which had once been guarded, now opened slightly, and she offered him a tentative smile, one that was hesitant, but filled with the possibility of something more. I don't know what to say, she confessed, her voice soft, her eyes searching his for answers. Daniel's chest tightened at her words, not because of the uncertainty in them, but because of the hope he saw in her gaze. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his voice gentle but filled with a quiet yearning. I didn't come here to ask for anything. I just wanted to meet you. To finally be real. Maya nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The truth of their history hung in the air like a delicate thread between them, one that had the power to unravel or to strengthen whatever connection they might share. I think I've waited for this moment, she whispered, more to herself than to him. And in that simple admission, Daniel realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for as well, not just to meet her, but to truly connect with her, not as the faceless writer, but as a man who had been touched by the very words he had shared. They sat there in the silence that followed, the air between them still charged with that unspoken history, but now with the promise of something more. What began as a tentative first conversation, filled with awkwardness and vulnerability, slowly began to take shape into something real, something tangible. And in that moment, they both understood, the words were just the beginning, and what came next, whatever that might be, was what truly mattered. Maya sat quietly, her heart a whirlwind of uncertainty, as she watched Daniel across the room, his easy confidence and charm radiating in a way that both captivated and unsettled her. She had known him long enough to feel the pull of something real between them, a connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying, yet the doubts lingered, doubts that gnawed at her every time they shared a quiet moment or a deep conversation. Why would someone like him choose someone like me? The question echoed in her mind, refusing to be silenced. Daniel, with his charisma and success, could have anyone, and Maya, well, she was nothing extraordinary. She had spent most of her life questioning her worth, and this newfound affection from someone who seemed to have everything only amplified her insecurities. Her fears whispered that perhaps he was simply indulging in a fleeting interest, or that his feelings for her were more about a passing infatuation than something deeper. Every time he smiled at her, every time he held her gaze with a tenderness that felt too raw to be real, a tiny voice inside her fought to remind her that she wasn't enough, that no one like Daniel could ever truly see her for who she was, let alone love her. But Daniel could see it, and he could feel it, too, the growing distance between them, the hesitation in her eyes when she pulled away from his touch, the walls she unconsciously built around her heart. It hurt him, not because of any arrogance, but because he genuinely cared for Maya in a way he hadn't expected. He saw beyond the layers of self-doubt that clouded her perception of herself, he saw the strength in her vulnerability, the beauty in her kindness, and the depth of her intelligence. To him, Maya was everything he had unknowingly been searching for, a woman who didn't just meet his eyes but saw him for who he truly was, unmasked and raw. And so, One evening as they sat together in the soft glow of a cafe, Daniel finally addressed the tension between them. With a gentleness that belied his usual confidence, he took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Maya," he began, his voice low, "I need you to know that I'm not here because you're some passing interest or because I think you're just a pretty face. I'm here because you matter to me. You're everything I never knew I needed." Maya looked down, unable to meet his eyes, her mind racing with a mix of relief and disbelief. "But why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, the vulnerability in her words laying bare the insecurities that had been festering inside her for so long. "You could have anyone. Why would you choose someone like me?" Daniel's gaze softened, and he gently lifted her chin, tilting it just enough so their eyes could meet. "Maya, I'm not looking for someone perfect," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm looking for someone real. Someone who doesn't hide behind a mask, someone who sees me for who I am, not the version of me that's easy to admire. I'm here because you are who I want. Not anyone else, not some idealized version of you, but you with all your doubts, your fears, your quirks, your strengths. You're enough, just as you are." His words hung in the air, a quiet promise that settled in Maya's chest, reaching places she hadn't allowed herself to open in a long time. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him, to let go of the nagging doubts that had clouded her heart. It wasn't easy, it wasn't as simple as pushing aside years of insecurities and self-questioning, but Daniel's unwavering belief in her slowly began to unravel the tight knots of fear she had built around her heart. As they sat there, wrapped in the warmth of his sincerity, Maya realized that love, real love, wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of who she should be, or worrying about whether she was enough. It was about being seen and accepted for who she truly was, the messy, beautiful, complicated person who had spent too many years doubting her worth. Daniel didn't see her as a project to be fixed or a puzzle to be solved, he saw her as someone worthy of love, just as she was. And for the first time, Maya believed it. That night, she let go of the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart, allowing herself to trust in the love that Daniel was offering her, not because he was perfect, but because he had shown her that the love he gave was real, and it was for her. It wasn't a fleeting affection or a passing interest, it was a love that had roots, deep and grounded, and it was something she could trust. With that realization, the doubts began to fade. In their place grew a quiet confidence, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this kind of love. And as Daniel gently held her hand, Maya knew that, for the first time, she wasn't just wanted, she was truly seen. Maya and Daniel's journey was one that began not with grand promises or bold declarations, but with quiet moments of vulnerability and tentative steps toward trust. Both carried the weight of their pasts. Maya, whose heart had been scarred by broken relationships and unspoken expectations, and Daniel, who had built walls around his emotions to protect himself from the fear of being hurt again. At first, their connection seemed unlikely, two souls carrying different burdens, unsure whether they could offer each other anything other than fleeting comfort. Maya often found herself questioning whether she was enough, plagued by self-doubt and the belief that her imperfections made her unworthy of love. Daniel, too, struggled with similar insecurities, hiding his true feelings behind a facade of indifference, afraid that if he allowed someone to get too close, they might eventually see his weaknesses and turn away. Yet, despite their guardedness, something began to shift between them, subtle at first, like the first flicker of light in a dark room. It was in the small, everyday moments, a shared glance across a crowded room, the gentle laughter over a shared joke, the quiet understanding that passed between them when words failed. These moments, though brief, began to chip away at the walls they had both carefully constructed around their hearts, revealing the potential for something deeper and more meaningful. As they spent more time together, they slowly learned to open up, not just about their hopes and dreams, but about their fears, their regrets, and the parts of themselves they had hidden for so long. Maya discovered that Daniel's silence was not indifference, but a defense mechanism, a shield he had built to protect himself from the pain of past failures. Daniel, in turn, learned that Maya's need for reassurance came not from weakness, but from the raw tenderness of a heart that had been bruised but not broken. With each shared conversation, each act of kindness, and each tender gesture, they began to see each other not as incomplete beings seeking validation, but as two people who could find healing in one another's presence. The more they trusted each other, the more their bond grew, slowly blossoming into a love that was built not on perfection, but on acceptance. They learned that it was okay to be imperfect, that vulnerability was not a weakness but a strength, and that the most beautiful connections are often those that are forged in the quiet, unspoken understanding that two people can be enough for each other, flaws and all. Their relationship became a testament to the power of patience and empathy, proving that even the most unlikely connections can grow into something beautiful. Through their shared experiences, they discovered that love was not about finding someone who was perfect, but about finding someone who was willing to face their insecurities together, someone who would stand by them as they both worked through their fears and doubts. As the seasons changed and time passed, Maya and Daniel realized that they were no longer the same people who had first met, guarded and unsure. They had both evolved, not because they had been fixed, but because they had found a love that allowed them to be whole in their imperfections. The bond they shared was not about escaping their pasts or erasing their insecurities, but about finding strength in vulnerability and creating a future where they could support each other's growth. In the end, Maya and Daniel's relationship wasn't just about love, it was about learning to embrace their own flaws and accepting each other despite them. It was a love that proved that even the most unlikely connections, born from fear and insecurity, could grow into something beautiful when nurtured with patience, trust, and the willingness to be open to the possibility of a new beginning. Through their shared journey, they found that sometimes, the most beautiful relationships come from the places we least expect, and that love, at its core, is not about perfection, but about growth, acceptance, and the courage to be vulnerable together.